This is the Australian War Cemetery on Ambon. It's run by the War Graves Commission and it contains the remains of 2,137 Allied servicemen. But the Ambon Cemetery has a special significance for these men. They're an advance party of veterans from the 2nd 21st Battalion AIF, otherwise known as Gull Force, and they first came to Ambon in December 1941. There were just over 1,100 of them, and almost 4 in 5 never returned to Australia. Of the 2,000-odd men buried here, almost 700 are from Gull Force. The 2nd 21st landed on Ambon the week after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had attacked Malaya and at the height of their strength were poised to strike down through Singapore, the Dutch East Indies and New Guinea. From its base in Darwin, Gull Force and its sister battalion, the 2nd 40th, were sent to Ambon and Timor respectively to deny the Japanese a base for a future attack on Australia. Gull Force was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Roach, who had reconnoitred Ambon 6 months earlier in May. Despite the presence of over 2,500 Dutch and Indonesian troops on the island, we now know that Roach's commander in Darwin had twice warned headquarters in Melbourne that the force was insufficient for the job. Nevertheless, on December 16, 1941, the men of Gull Force disembarked at Ambon. The hopelessness of the position was not lost on Colonel Roach. In his first week on the island, Roach sent a total of 4 signals to headquarters, desperately requesting more arms and men. The day after Christmas, he received a terse reply from the Deputy Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Sidney Rowell.
Additional units you asked for, not available. Your task in cooperation with local Dutch forces is to put up the best defence possible with the resources you have at your disposal.
By January, Roach's frustration was clearly evident. He signalled headquarters.
I find it difficult to overcome a feeling of disgust at the way in which we have seemingly been dumped in this outpost position. Although I thoroughly appreciate the importance of time and delaying action, I cannot be convinced that the throwing away of a force like this, for the sake of anything up to a 3 days delay to the enemy, is worth the sacrifice of so many valuable lives. In the meantime, you can be assured that all it is possible to do will be done with the means at our disposal, and that this force will acquit itself with skill and determination. But I do feel it's high time heroics should be abandoned in favour of realities.
But while Roach believed he was simply stating the obvious, his constant signals, some described them as alarmist messages, were beginning to grate back at Army headquarters. On January 14, the Allied Supreme Commander for the Southwest Pacific, General Sir Archibald Wavell, sent a personal note to the Chief of the Australian General Staff, General Sir Vernon Sturdy. Wavell wrote,
"Communications received from the commander of the 2nd 21st Battalion at Ambon make it clear he has no spirit to conduct a resolute defence if attacked. I have accordingly decided to replace him in command."
Roach's replacement was Colonel W.J.R. Scott, who was the battalion's liaison officer at headquarters.
When Roach was relieved of his command, of course, it was said in the communique that he simply didn't have the resolution to conduct a solid defence. Do you think that was right?
I don't believe so. I believe that if Colonel Roach had been left here, we would have fought on and not surrendered so soon. In fact, he would have just fought and fought, virtually to the last man. I do believe that.
Was it a bad military decision just to change commanders so at that critical moment, sir?
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah, I think it was a complete tragedy, really, because the battalion had been under Colonel Roach, respected him, and, you know, really had a lot of time for him. And suddenly, a fortnight before we were attacked, he was recalled, and we had another CO that we didn't even know, and that wasn't good for morale, not one little bit.
So people thought that Colonel Roach was unfairly dealt with?
I think so, yes. Yeah, we all thought that.
The whole unit had a tremendous respect for Colonel Roach, and I'm afraid that could not be said of his successor. I believe his successor was too old, he was unfit, and I believe he was out of date. He'd been doing staff work since the beginning of the war, and I frankly do not believe he was fitted for the task.
Documents held in the Australian War Memorial show that 3 days before Roach was relieved, Colonel Scott, a veteran of the First World War, had offered to take over as commander of Gull Force. In a note to Sturdy, he wrote,
"A stubborn resistance and a good fight, even against overwhelming odds now, must stiffen resistance everywhere and clinch our association with the Dutch, not to mention the effect on the USA. I consider there is a political significance behind this which may well be worth consideration."
One day after relieving Roach of his command, General Wavell wrote to Sturdy,
So far as I can judge, the position at Ambon is not critical, and in any case I'm opposed to handing out important objectives to the enemy without making them fight for it.
They were the first indications that the plan to leave Gull Force on Ambon to face the Japanese may have had a political dimension. That Gull Force would stay on the island, at least partly to keep up appearances with the Allies. On the night of January 30, the Japanese Army and Navy attacked Ambon in overwhelming strength. The defenders were outnumbered by at least 6 to 1. Within 4 days, the Japanese had taken the island.
Well, the Japanese attacked mainly from the north and east and southeast of the island. And at the very beginning of their attack, the Australian force was spread over to the west of the town of Ambon and also on the Laha aerodrome. It wasn't until a day later that we encountered the Japanese.
How did you first encounter them?
Well, the Dutch, who were nominally defending the north and the eastern end of the island, unfortunately for us, surrendered quite early in the piece and left the Japanese free entry, so to speak, into the island. And they moved on from the north onto the Laha aerodrome and from the east through the town to the west side of the town where the main portion of Gull Force were. Our task, of course, was to defend the town of Ambon. The Japanese also had many ships ready for the landing, particularly down in the southwest. Also naval ships which were coming up Ambon Bay.
You were, of course, heavily outnumbered. How did the battle actually go? It was only a matter of days, of course, before
we were heavily outnumbered. The Australian force numbered 1,131 at the time the Japanese attacked. The Dutch Netherlands East Indies force numbered something like 2,600, mainly of militia troops. They were led by Dutch and Eurasian officers and NCOs, but they, having surrendered quite early in the piece, left the Australian force to its own devices.
How many Japanese were pitted against you?
The estimate figure of Japanese was something, as I understand it, either landed or available in ships to land, something in the neighbourhood of 20,000.
Well, Sir Archibald Wavell later said he didn't believe in surrendering objectives to the enemy without making them fight for it. And the subsequent commander of Gull Force had suggested that the presence of Gull Force on Ambon was important for appearances with the Dutch and with the Americans. Was it simply a political decision, do you think?
That is so. He said that he did not agree with evacuation at all. He also said he expected Gull Force to hold on for 48 hours, and we held on for 96, double his requirement, or his suggestion, put it that way. But what you say is correct, that he did not believe an area of importance should be surrendered. I suppose in certain in appropriate respects that is understandable, but Colonel Roach could foresee the hopelessness of the whole thing, and he certainly believed that the force was inadequate. It is a point of interest to follow up from there that I have read documents signed by the Chief of the General Staff who indicated that they had conflicted with one of the principles of war, which is concentration, by spreading the 23rd Infantry Brigade from Rabaul, Ambon and Timor, which covers well into 4 figures in miles.
This was the site that greeted the prisoners on Ambon in September 1945, after 4 years as prisoners of war. 4 Australian corvettes coming to take them home. The captain of the corvette La Trobe was Lieutenant Commander Windus Smith.
My ship did not berth alongside immediately. Our task was to keep an eye on the other ships berthing in case of treachery. But when we did berth, there were 20 or 30 skeletons fallen in on the jetty as if they were in front of Buckingham Palace. There wasn't a dry eye on my ship. It was a most emotional occasion. When I say skeletons, we discovered that they weighed about 6 stone, but that would include big men like that chap I'm looking at now who weighs 14. Their thighs were about matchsticks and their knees like oversized cricket balls.
How did the prisoners on the wharf react when the corvettes came into Ambon Harbour?
Well, they remained strictly at attention until we invited them to join us, of course. And our fellows, with the best of intentions, saw that food was necessary and they proceeded to provide it. But of course... there
was no emotion, no cheering? No.
Well, there was no cheering, there was more crying amongst our fellows.
Saturday, April the 23rd, 2 days before Anzac Day, and an Air Force Caribou lands at Ambon's Laha airstrip. Aboard the plane are more Gull Force veterans, a few from the RAN Corvette Association, and a couple from 13 Squadron RAAF, who also served on Ambon.
Yeah, who's who now? Rod Gabriel. Trevor. That's right, Trevor. Rod Gabriel.
The men of Gull Force have made an annual pilgrimage to Ambon since 1967, when Indonesia lifted its entry restrictions against Australians. The bloodiest episode on the island took place here, beside the Laha airstrip. And to the inhabitants of the tiny village of Tawiri, just a kilometre away, Anzac Day means just this. But as they've done for the past 21 years, the Australians are coming. After the Australians defending Laha surrendered, a Japanese mine layer hit a Dutch mine in Ambon Harbour, killing some of the crew. In retaliation, some 250 prisoners at Laha, including 229 from Gull Force, were beheaded and bayoneted and buried in mass graves. The remains have since been removed to the war cemetery, but the memorial in the village of Tawiri stands in recognition of the battalion's blackest hour. But despite the atrocities, and despite 4 years in the prison camps, there are surprisingly few regrets.
Well, if you'd been evacuated, of course, you would have just handed the island over to the Japanese and they would have secured this as a base much sooner. And which I don't know what the general public know, but Darwin was bombed from aircraft carriers, Japanese, and also from planes from the Laha aerodrome, while we didn't know when they took off. As we found out later in the day, we saw the planes taking off to bomb Darwin.
So despite the fact that you lost over 700 men, the defence wasn't entirely futile?
No, I think that is quite reasonable to say that, yes, I must agree.
I think so, because to start with, they've got to decide their plan of attack. They've got to attack, consolidate, and this gave Australia more breathing time than had we not been here or evacuated in the